Welcome to the last video of this series based on Sandra McGuire's list of 10 metacognitive strategies. In this video, we'll be focusing on the assessment phase of the study cycle. For the purposes of this video, think of the two types of assessment, formative and summative, like this. Formative is the monitoring that you do along the way, sort of like tasting the soup you're cooking to check if it needs more salt. Formative assessment gives us the ability to make those small changes and course corrections along the way. Whereas summative assessment is what's done at the end of your project. That's more like reviewing a meal on Yelp. The last phase of the study cycle relates to assessment. And at the beginning, we're just talking about that little a assessment. That's what I call the type of formative self-testing work that happens here. Regardless of the assessment required by the instructor at this stage in the semester, a student should be conducting that little a assessment of their own learning with self-testing all along the way, at the very least weekly. A student who prepares a mock exam or quiz for themselves weekly will be much more prepared going into an actual exam. And then speaking of that exam, we'll move on to preparation for the assessment that the instructor does a little later in the video. For subjects that require short essays or essay test questions, look to the review questions typically found at the end of the chapter in a textbook. Students can try the 1-minute paper technique using these questions as prompts to gauge how much they can remember from the topic without referring to their notes or the text. Each week, students following the study cycle will be creating their own mock quizzes or exams from all the course material that they've gathered. If the instructor provides their notes to students in the form of PowerPoint slides or outlines, students can use these to help them create questions for the mock quizzes. However, these instructor notes and slides can never adequately replace the student's own notes taken by hand. If the textbook offers an online component, look for pre-made mock quizzes or interactive learning activities. Let's look at two of the tools that we use with students: the Exam Prep Planner and the Exam Wrapper handouts. You'll find those in the Files section of this Canvas course shell. Asking your student the questions here often reveals a lot about how your student does and does not prepare for exams. We all know what preparing means. Eat breakfast, get some sleep, study hard, don't stress yourself out, right? Oh, if only it were that easy. The actual questions here have answers such as number 1, the first day of class. Number 2, your study group members, your success coach, professor, anyone who has the ability to encroach upon your time or make demands on your time. Number 3, well, lots of different ways, some of which we've already talked about. And yes, science and math are more technical courses for which you would prepare much differently than you would for a course in the humanities or social sciences. For questions 4 and 5, it makes sense to help your student learn how to create and enact a plan to prepare physically and emotionally as well as mentally. Put a reminder in their phone to start winding down early the night before. Remind them to lay out their clothes and class materials. Make sure they have a couple of power bars on hand. Have the self-talk statements and the affirmations already prepared. Looking at the Exam Prep Planner, this tool is a fantastic way to introduce your student to the concept of planning to prepare, planning to study, all the various activities and considerations that might entail. You can ask your student, which parts of the planner are you most familiar with? And that can spark a conversation on the parts of the planner that are completely unfamiliar to the student. Additionally, the Exam Wrapper is a tool that helps students take an honest look at their preparation efforts and evaluate where they can make changes moving forward. It's important to stress to your student that the most important takeaway here from the previous exam result is just how it will inform their behavior moving forward. This isn't to make them feel bad or call them out. It's just for their own use in making changes and adjustments in how they prepare for the next exam. In that way, they can consider an exam both formative, course changing, and summative. Because we mentioned using question charts as one way of studying, I thought it'd be helpful to place one here for reference. These are great tools in assisting students in organizing information and help them make gaps in a student's knowledge immediately evident so that they can prompt further study and inquiry. Students can create even more questions, dig deeper into the hows and the whys of the content. For example, the chart tells us that communism's biggest problem in Japan was that the political theory is incompatible with Japan's national character. But why was it incompatible? In what ways do communism and Japan's national character not align? To get started with a matrix, think of any concept that has types, kinds, or categories. For example, the political parties of Japan in this figure, perfect examples. On a scratch paper or in your notebook, create a grid similar to the one above. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to create an example matrix that compares and contrasts somatic symptom disorders from an abnormal psychology class I took. So let's start putting this matrix together. We'll start with the types, the varieties of somatic and dissociative disorders. So what distinguishes each of these from the others? Well, they can have different symptoms. Some have a different amount of time that symptoms must be present for diagnosis, and the treatment best practices are different. Now that we have our information organized, we can start making up questions that can be answered by our matrix. We're going to step aside for a few moments and talk about a very specific subject, math. A lot of our students come to EMU with the mindset that math is hard. They aren't good at math. They aren't math people. In fact, you're probably thinking to yourself right now, I hate math. And the true answer is that most of us were taught to memorize multiplication tables and formulas, never really dug into the whys behind the math problems that we do. We weren't taught the right way to learn math. And in fact, we were often encouraged to do exactly the wrong things when doing math homework. In order for a student to really know whether they understand the concepts, they must be able to work a problem correctly without referring back to their notes or to the textbook or sample already solved problems. Verbal translation is one way to help students dig into the reasoning behind the steps needed in math problems. We do an activity in UNIB that explains this process, that process of verbal translation.